Hello and welcome to Experimental FPV. In this video, I'll show you how different designs of arm shapes affect strength and stiffness. FPV drones use many different arm shapes. Some are flatter, some are more square, some are actually tubes. In this video, I'm going to explore which shape is the best. Stiffer arms can lead to a smoother flight, while stronger arms will have to be changed less often, which are both very nice things to have in FPV drones. The way I completed this experiment is I first modeled each shape in Autodesk Inventor. I then used Autodesk Inventor Nastran to use a modal frequency response analysis. This showed me the displacement and stress on the part at different frequencies. The length, density, volume, mass, material, force, location of force, and all our factors are identical for each shape. The only thing that changes is the actual shape of the arm. I would go into more detail on how my exact setup for Autodesk Inventor Nastran is, but I'll do that in a different video. I applied a 10 Newton load first normally or perpendicularly up and down, and then to the side to each part. I then accounted for the biggest stress that I found in a part, which was given to me directly from the program, Autodesk Inventor Nastran, and the displacement. How far has the part moved from its original position? I also looked at the peak hertz. This shows me how stiff a part is. The higher the hertz, the better. Let's dive straight into the results. For each shape, for example, this is the square shape, I have two graphs, which show the displacement over the frequency in both the normal load and the side load. In the table below, I have more exact values of the max stress the part experienced, the max displacement the part experienced, and the peak hertz at which that occurred. For symmetrical shapes like the square, the normal and the side performance was identical. It is important to note that it's the worst performance that makes the most difference, because if you have a link of very strong metal and you have one link, just one out of 100 that is plastic, the chain will break at that weakest link. So it doesn't matter how strong the other metal is. All that matters is what the weakest point is. In this case, the performance was identical, so this doesn't apply here, but we can see that at 106 megapascals, 5 millimeters displacement, and 300 hertz, this was a solid performance and pretty much middle of the pack. Some notes on the square shape. It has the best stress performance in normal test, which is really significant, and this design allows for easy interlocking of the arms, which is really important for torque and stiffness of the whole frame. Also, it's the most readily available design and leaves lots of space for components. That's why it's most often used in most frames. The peak frequencies are symmetrical, so there can be coupling between the axes, but that's a minor point. The next design I tested is a flat sheet. It is identical to a square, except it's flatter. As you can see, performance suffered a lot. 413 megapascals was the stress experience at the max point, which means this will break almost 4 times as soon as the square shape. The peak frequency was also extremely low at 65 hertz, and the max displacement was 98.5 millimeters, which is flat out horrendous. This was definitely the worst shape overall, so if you have flat arms, get rid of them. Resonant frequencies are split though, since the shape is not symmetrical, so some axes perform better than others. And also, because the shape is so wide, there's less space for components. The next shape I did is a curve. As you will notice, I have two curves. I have a convex curve and a curved. The curved is a concave curve, where the curve comes in, while the convex curve will come out. This one actually surprised me. I, along with many people in the hobby, believe that adding curves will be strengthening the part. But what actually happened in my case, at least I'm assuming, since I had to add a curve, I had to add more material on the side, making the whole part thinner to make the same volume for each part, which actually made it weaker than the square shape. It experienced more stress at 142 megapascals. It experienced more displacement at 7.7 millimeters, and the peak hertz was high. Actually, the peak hertz was lower at 275. And on the side performance, it performed better. Again, it's asymmetric against all axes, so performances are different. But again, the weakest link is a limiting factor here, so overall it performed worse than the square shape. Some notes is that peak frequencies are again split because the cross section is not symmetric, and this is a relatively common design that you'll see most often, but it is worse than the square shape. The next is the tapered. Now this is just like the curve, but instead of having any curve to it, it just tapers from a wider to a thinner point. Overall, this surprised me. This performed better than the curved shape in almost every single regard. It had less stress, lower displacement, and higher peak frequencies. It didn't have the same results as the side, but overall the lowest values were still better than the worst values of the curved shape. It actually outperformed the square shape in displacement and hertz. So you're sacrificing a little bit of strength for better stiffness. Some interesting results. Again, biggest takeaways here is that the better performance in curved shapes was just a straight taper, and I've never seen this design used, just a straight taper. So maybe manufacturers will start using this more often. The next one is a tube. Now the tube really surprised me. There's one proponent I see who eagerly tells everyone to use tubes, and that is Timmy RC, creator of the tubular quad. Hopefully, I'll someday be able to talk to him in an interview. But this had 107 megapascals, only 1 megapascal larger than the square shape, but it had only 1.6 millimeters of displacement, making it the stiffest arm in the whole lineup. And the frequency was also pretty high at 510 megahertz, or just hertz, I'm sorry. But there's a lot of notes with tube arms. Although most of the stress was concentrated at the base, which means if you were to reinforce the base, you would have even better performance. More on this later. Also, tubes and rods and anything that has more centralized mass will have better torque performance. Although I didn't test that in my experiment, this will definitely be one of the best performers in the torque department. Also, a round shape of the tube will have aerodynamic benefits. I don't know how major those will be, but that is still there. And you'll be able to hide your motor wires inside, which is a nice benefit. And overall, this was the best performing shape, which was quite surprising. There are quite a bit of drawbacks to the tube arms though. They're hard to interlock. It's hard to mount motors to them. It's hard to mount to the frame, and peak frequencies are symmetrical. So if the engineering technicalities can be overcome, tubes probably would be the best shape. The next is the rod, and the rod actually surprised me. The rod was significantly worse than the tube, with having 238 megapascals of stress, 5.4 millimeters of displacement, and 285 hertz in the frequency department. It is way worse than the square, which I found really interesting. Again, this is just worse in every single standard than the tube, but it also has all the downsides of the tube. So if you're choosing between a rod and a tube, definitely go with a tube. And now is a triangle or a truss arm shape. Of course, there's many different variations, but I'm just using the general shape just to get some general trends. And you can see it performed really well, especially in the side test. In the normal test, it didn't perform quite as well with 8.2 millimeters of displacement and 260 hertz as the peak hertz, but the stress was really good. Another thing I'll notice in our notes, if you can see in the picture, right now the stress is somewhere in the middle, top third of the shape. This is one of the few shapes that as the frequency went up, where the stress was centralized in the part changed. What this means, that's the first point, stress was distributed through the length, which means it's very efficient in using its whole mass to its max efficiency. But if you want to make the whole part stronger, you would have to add mass to the whole part, as opposed to, like, for example, like the tube, which you just have to put mass in the first half and it would have a much greater effect. This would also have a great torque performance as it has a wide base and it'd be very hard to twist. And the peak frequencies are split, so coupling between the axes would be very minimal. And it had the best side performance out of anything. If you look back on this chart, it is ridiculous. The performance is less than a millimeter in displacement. One minor point is that there is a chance of getting stuck in a tree, as there is a wide gap, and if that gets stuck on a branch, it'd be really hard to get your drone out of a tree. Minor point, but for something to keep in mind. It's also harder to interlock these arms. They usually just bolted onto the frame, and which reduces torque efficiency, but it's not even needed most of the times because it is such good performing shape. And some less space for components as you have wide base. Finally, here the last shape is the convex curve. It's very similar to the other curve. Again, it's just convex instead of concave, and it performed even worse, which again I attribute to the fact that it had to be thinner and flatter versus having mass more centralized. 173 megapascals in max stress, 16.48 millimeters in displacement, and 180 hertz peak frequency. So pretty bad performance overall. Worse than a square shape. Not much to be said there. So here are the final results with everything on the board. As you can see, again, the square shape and the tube and the triangle shapes are probably the three best candidates for shapes. A few interesting conclusions that you can see is that often strength in one direction can be achieved at the cost of strength in another. What this means is if you have an asymmetrical pattern, a cross section, something that's flatter, it'll be stronger in one section than the other, which can change the peak frequencies and decrease coupling, but will make the part overall less stiff and less strong. Another interesting conclusion I came up with was straight tapers are stronger than curved ones. This is something I didn't see coming, but I guess it's there. Also, the tubes are extremely efficient at both strength and stiffness, and definitely will be looking at that when I'm making this drone myself. More on that later. And also, centralized mass is key when we're talking at strength. Except in the case of the rod, having more centralized mass in case of a square and the tube was better for strength and stiffness. I already talked about asymmetric designs and how they offer peak frequency splitting up, but again, that costs more mass for it to be efficient. Some limitations of my study. Every single good researcher, an experiment person, scientist, if you will give you the limitations of their research. There was some variation of volume as I was not able to get the exact volume, so I would give about plus or minus 150 cubic millimeters, which is very little, but it is there. I did not directly test the torque of these items as it was extremely difficult to set that up, and therefore I do not have direct data to that, but I can give you basic ideas of how they will perform on a torque scale. Basically, if it's used on an axle, it's basically good. So anything that's round, using an axle, square axles are used. Anything that's flatter is not used on an axle because it's not efficient and won't handle torque as well. I only considered two force orientations, the perpendicular and side. I could have done more, but that would have taken a lot more time. And I also did not test combination of forces like side and normal, which would enhance the coupling effect and maybe show off better shapes, their strengths of maybe asymmetrical shapes more. But that's something I just couldn't take into account. Finally, this is just a simulation. I wanted to make this in real life, but after 3D printing the components, I found that it's not a fair comparison, as the line of the layers of 3D print make it not really fair comparison between all the shapes. For the future, if you're wondering who the heck I am and why I'm making this video, it is because I'm going to actually be creating a really good flying FPV drone. My goal is to just make a bunch of experiments and find the best parts for an FPV drone and design a drone that has vibration isolation, good design. I'm also going to be doing changes to a software pit improvements. I'm working on a program right now, and I'm going to be looking at the best components, testing certain myths like soft mounted motors, and making a beautiful drone. I am hoping to make more practical experiments with real black box data in real life soon, but for now I'm going to be doing more theoretical experiments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and hopefully you enjoyed. And if you did, please subscribe and like, because that would be really helpful. Down in the description below, you will see a link to this Excel spreadsheet where you'll see all the data and you'll see all the graphs for all the shapes. Furthermore, if you want to see any more of the data or the files I used, please contact me. I'm willing to share. I hope you have a great day.